The halls of Asuncion had once held music, gold, and speeches about the future. That morning, what was left of the country fit inside a valley of thick brush. 4,000 cavalrymen surrounded a stream of knee-deep water to capture around 400 barefoot starving people. And in that stream, an entire nation ended. It wasn't a last battle. It was 5 years of calculated collapse compressed into a single morning. This is against all odds, and this is Cerro Corá. But before we start, one thing needs to be clear. The Cerro Corá you were taught is different from the one that actually happened, and that holds on both sides of the border. In Brazil, it became a footnote. In Paraguay, it became an altar. Neither version survives contact with the records, but to understand how a continental war ended in water shallow enough to wade across, we need to go back 5 years to the day Paraguay bet everything. In the early 1860s, Paraguay was a strange country by regional standards, small, landlocked, breathing entirely through its rivers, and, at the same time, armed like almost no one else. It had its own foundry, iron workshops, a telegraph line, and one of the first railways in South America, rails running there before much larger neighbors managed the same. In the arsenals of the capital, the air smelled of hot resin, coal, and freshly poured metal. This was not a backwater. This was a state that had spent decades building the machinery of a modern country in a hurry, under a government that answered to almost no one. And that created a dangerous confidence. The belief that a small nation with a foundry and a standing army could set the terms of a regional crisis, because the region was in dispute. The Rio de la Plata was the commercial artery of the continent, and whoever controlled its banks controlled everything that floated down it. When Brazil intervened militarily in Uruguay, the government in Asuncion read it as the first move of an encirclement. It forged, it armed, it believed. And believing it could not afford to wait, it moved first. The gamble was made. What Paraguay had not calculated was who would answer, because the answer was not one country. Paraguay's strike brought Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay into a formal alliance against it. 3 states with more population, more coastline, more credit, and more access to European arms markets than Paraguay could reach at all. A nation of, at most, a bit over 1 million people had just declared itself the enemy of a coalition many times its size. And that created the arithmetic that would decide everything long before any general did. A country can arm itself far faster than it can afford the war that follows. Here is where the popular version starts to slip. The popular version says this was David against Goliath, a heroic little nation crushed by imperial greed. The records show something more tragic. For the first 2 years, Paraguay was not the underdog on the battlefield at all. Its army was larger and better prepared than anything its neighbors could field immediately, and it won engagements. What defeated it was not a single decisive defeat. It was time. Time meant blockade. The rivers that let Paraguay breathe were closed. No imports of powder, no replacement rifles, no medicine, no spare parts for the workshops that had made the country proud. Time meant the fortress of Humaitá. Years of siege lines, trenches, and river guns, a war of engineers and disease rather than cavalry charges. Time meant a rate of loss no small population can absorb. Every year, the Allied armies replaced their casualties from a pool of millions. Paraguay replaced its own from a pool that was already emptying. Sieges do not kill armies, arithmetic does, and that created something no army manual has a page for, a war that continued after the state that started it had effectively ceased to function. By 1869, the capital had fallen, and the government was a column moving through the hills. This is the part that is genuinely hard to describe without either flattening it or dressing it up. What marched north was not an army. It was the last administrative fiction of a country, a marshal-president, a handful of loyal officers, an elderly vice-president, wounded men, adolescents and civilians who had nowhere else to go. They ate palm hearts and roots. Uniforms had become rags. Most were barefoot. The column carried decorations and promotion papers it still issued in the hills to men who were starving. And in August of that year, at Aquidabán-Niguí, a force that included boys far too young for any of it was destroyed. I'm not going to stage that for you. It's enough to say that it happened, that it is remembered every year in Paraguay as a Children's Day of mourning, and that no framing makes it acceptable. They starved, they marched, they stayed, and that created the final geography of the war, a column of a few hundred moving toward a valley in the northeast called Cerro Corá. It is a natural amphitheater, flat-topped hills covered in forest, a green bowl with a shallow stream running through it, the Aquidabán-Niguí. In the humid Paraguayan summer, low mist sits on those hills at dawn and burns off into hard golden light by mid-morning. The green there is aggressive, almost obscene in its health, and it is the last thing that Column would have wanted to see, a landscape thriving while the people crossing it starved. Camped in that bowl, the marshal refused the last offers to negotiate or escape. There is something worth sitting with here, because it is the hinge of the whole argument that follows. He was not cornered without options. Terms had been offered. Routes out had existed. Every one of them required him to leave, and leaving was the one thing he would not do. The hills above him were already being taken. On the morning of the 1st of March, 1870, Brazilian cavalry enters the valley along two axes at once. And here the word battle does real damage to the truth. There is no battle line. There is no maneuver. The column has no ammunition to speak of and no formation to hold. What happens is a collapse. Pockets of resistance around the few officers still standing, people running through high grass, carts overturned in red mud. The popular version says Cerro Corá was the last battle of the Paraguayan War. The records show something stranger and sadder. The fighting lasted a fraction of a morning, and the Brazilian commander's standing order was not to destroy the column at all. General Câmara's order was to take the marshal alive. That order matters, and it is the reason this is not a simple story of butchery. It is also the reason the ending is so bitter, because it was refused. The vice president is killed resisting. So is the marshal's teenage son. Paraguayan tradition holds that the boy answered a demand to surrender with the words, "I die with my country." And it's honest to say that line comes to us through oral tradition, not a verified transcript. What is not in dispute is that he was 15, and that he did not put down his weapon. 200 meters away, the war has one more minute to run. The marshal is wounded by a lance and drags himself down to the water. Brazilian soldiers reach the bank and call on him to surrender. He answers in Spanish, "Muero con mi patria." I die with my country. He refuses. And in the shallow water of the Aquidabán, it ends. I'm not going to show you that. What the valley holds afterwards is the part worth carrying. Running water, a reflection, and a silence that had been 5 years arriving. The water runs, the mist lifts, the valley empties. Nearby, a European woman in a mud-stained traveling dress digs a grave for her son with her own hands. She had followed that column for years, through the retreat, through the hunger, through the hills. There is no ceremony available to her. There is soil, and there are her hands. And this is where I want to be careful, because the temptation on both sides of this story is enormous. From the Brazilian side, the temptation is to file the mourning away as a tidy conclusion. The war ends, the column is dispersed, the map is settled. From the Paraguayan side, the temptation is to turn the stream into a shrine and stop asking questions in front of it. Neither serves the people who were actually in that valley. The Brazilian cavalrymen who rode in were themselves in the 6th year of a war that had eaten their own army from the inside. Men who had buried more friends to cholera and dysentery than to Paraguayan rifles. They were not conquerors arriving in triumph. They were exhausted men finishing something that should have finished long before. A war that took 5 years to fight ended in water shallow enough to wade. And that created the argument that has never been settled since. The popular version says the man in that stream was either a martyr or a monster. The records show something more uncomfortable. Both readings are built from the same documented facts. He refused every chance to abandon his country, and he stayed to the literal end. He also drove a war long past the point of any achievable outcome, and executed men around him, including his own brothers-in-law, on suspicion of treason. Hero or tyrant is not a question the evidence resolves. It's a question about what you think a leader owes the people he leads. What is not debatable is the cost, and it has to be stated carefully, because this is where bad history does the most damage. Estimates of Paraguay's population loss diverge brutally, from roughly a fifth of the pre-war population to well over half. The pre-war population itself is disputed, from around 300,000 to more than 1 million. Any single figure you see quoted confidently is a choice between contested sources, not a measurement. What every serious estimate agrees on is that the proportion was catastrophic, and that it fell hardest on adult men, leaving a country rebuilt largely by women. The winners did not walk away clean either. Brazil finished the war with a debt that shaped its finances for a generation, and an army that had discovered its own political weight. Officers formed in that war would help end the monarchy that sent them. Argentina and Uruguay carried their own losses home. Victory collected slowly. There are defeats that erase an army, and there are decisions that erase a people. So let me put it to you. If you had stood in that valley with 400 starving people, no ammunition, no way out, and the hills already taken, would you have marched to the end with your country, or asked for terms to try to save whoever was left? Comment the word Aquidabán below so I know you made it to the end. Drop a like, subscribe, and if it makes sense for you, consider becoming a member. It helps me keep bringing these stories. Take care, and I'll see you at the next battle. Stay curious, stay analytical. History is never as settled as it seems.